Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that doesn't sound glamorous at all, but stay with me. We're talking about the blacksmiths of medieval Europe, the people who quite literally forged the Middle Ages, one sweaty hammer swing at a time. So, dim the lights, settle into your blanket, and imagine the faint ringing of iron echoing through a quiet medieval village, because tonight we're stepping into the smoky, back-breaking world of the medieval blacksmith. And yes, it's exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds. Now, most people think blacksmiths had this cool job. Fire, swords, heroic energy, maybe a glint of power from making the tools knights used to win wars. But in reality, being a blacksmith in the Middle Ages was the historical version of working in a 24-hour auto shop where no one ever thanked you. Everyone complained, and you inhaled charcoal dust for a living. It wasn't art, it was survival. Picture this. It's dawn. The rooster crows, though you barely slept because you spent half the night keeping your forge from cooling. You crawl out of your straw mattress, stretch your arms, and head to your tiny, smoke-filled workshop, a space that smells like burnt metal, sweat, and whatever animal hides you've used as bellows patches. No ventilation, no gloves, no protective goggles, just you, a hammer, a fire, and the hope you won't accidentally brand yourself before lunch. Your job, everything. You're the community's tech support, mechanic, weapons supplier, and sometimes emergency surgeon for broken plows. Farmers can't till without you. Knights can't fight without you. Even the church can't build its gates without you. And for all that, your reward is a small pile of coins and maybe some bread. Glamorous. But let's be honest. There was some pride in it too. The forge was a symbol of power. You could turn raw metal into anything: armor, tools, chains, hinges, or jewelry. You controlled the fire, and that made you important. It also made you permanently tired. Because medieval blacksmithing wasn't just a profession, it was a full-time arm workout with no gym membership. And since we're drifting into the weird little corners of medieval life, let's not pretend their working conditions were normal. Blacksmiths worked in what was basically a medieval sauna made of smoke and soot. Most shops had dirt floors, wooden beams, and constant risk of accidental arson. The forge fire had to stay hot enough to melt iron, which means temperatures that could roast a pig. And because you couldn't just turn it off, the fire had to be maintained through the day, and sometimes through the night. Oh, and that sound you hear. The constant ringing of metal on metal. Imagine that every single day for years. Your hearing would slowly fade. Your hands would become calloused like bark, and you'd probably develop a cough from all that inhaled soot. Romantic, right? But despite all the exhaustion, blacksmiths had status. People respected them, kind of. They weren't nobles, but they weren't peasants either. They sat somewhere in the middle, the backbone of every town. When a knight strutted through the market in shining armor, everyone admired him, but quietly. They knew that armor only existed because a sweaty man with a hammer made it possible. Let's drift deeper into that life, what they made, what they earned, and the strange rituals and beliefs that surrounded their craft. Because medieval people didn't just see blacksmiths as workers. They sometimes saw them as something almost magical. So let's sink a little deeper into that smoky, glowing world. Because medieval blacksmiths weren't just tradesmen. They were, in a weird way, the town's quiet sorcerers. Think about it. You take a cold, lifeless rock from the earth, iron ore, toss it into fire, hammer it until it sings, and pull out something sharp, strong, and shiny. To an average peasant watching from a distance, that looked suspiciously like witchcraft. Fire itself was sacred back then. People saw it as both divine and dangerous. And here's the blacksmith, literally controlling it, shaping it, talking to it even. Because that was part of the rhythm. Many blacksmiths worked alone, muttering under their breath, keeping the forge breathing with each pull of the bellows. To outsiders, that mumbling looked like spell work. You could say blacksmiths were the medieval version of engineers mixed with a hint of dark wizard energy. But here's the fun part. Medieval folklore actually leaned into that idea. In villages across Europe, blacksmiths were believed to have special protection from evil. Some stories claimed they could trap demons in their forges, or that iron itself scared away dark spirits. That's why iron horseshoes were nailed above doors, not for luck, but to ward off whatever creepy things were lurking in the night. The blacksmith's touch, they thought, made the iron pure and protective. Of course, that mystical respect didn't make the job any easier. The workday was brutal. From sunrise to sunset, the forge fire had to be maintained at temperatures high enough to melt and mold iron. There were no shifts, no weekends, and definitely no days off for mental health. The average blacksmith worked around 12 to 14 hours a day, and his meals were usually whatever he could eat one-handed between hammer strikes, usually bread, cheese, and beer. Lots of beer. That might sound like a good time, but it wasn't for fun. Beer was safer to drink than water, since medieval wells were basically bacterial soup. So blacksmiths, like most people, drank beer constantly, from breakfast to bedtime. It's no wonder many were described as strong but perpetually red-faced and slightly dizzy. And speaking of strength, these guys were built. Years of swinging hammers, hauling iron, and operating bellows turned them into walking mountains of muscle. There are records describing blacksmiths as barrel-chested and thick-armed. If a knight ever got too cocky, the blacksmith could probably knock him over with one swing of a ladle. Still, for all that effort, the pay was modest. Blacksmiths earned more than farmers but far less than merchants or craftsmen who dealt in luxury goods. They were essential but undervalued, a pattern that hasn't exactly disappeared in modern times. In small villages, payment might come in the form of food or favors instead of coins. You sharpened a farmer's plow. Maybe you got a sack of barley, fixed a wheel. You might get a chicken. Medieval economics at its finest. Yet even through exhaustion and heat and constant soot in their lungs, blacksmiths carried pride. Their work lasted. The nails they forged held castles together. The locks they made guarded church doors. The swords they shaped were passed down through generations. That permanence, that trace of their craft, gave them a sense of quiet immortality in a time when life itself was fragile. And as strange as it sounds, the forge wasn't just a workplace, it was a social hub. Villagers came by to chat, to ask for repairs, or to trade gossip while the blacksmith hammered away. The rhythmic clanging became part of the village soundtrack, reassuring, steady, like a heartbeat. Let's float now toward the social side of things, how blacksmiths fit into medieval communities, who they served, and how their position sometimes made them both respected and feared at the same time. So, picture this, a medieval village at dawn. The streets are still damp, roosters are shouting their opinions, and somewhere near the center of town, always near the center, there's that familiar rhythmic clang. That's the blacksmith, already at work before most people are even awake. His forge is more than just a workshop. It's the gravitational center of the village's daily life. If your plow broke, if your horse threw a shoe, if your door hinge snapped, you went to the blacksmith. He was part craftsman, part problem solver, part therapist, because let's be honest, everyone needed to complain about something while their tools were being fixed. Farmers talked about bad harvests, soldiers complained about their armor, and travelers swapped stories about faraway lands that probably didn't exist. The blacksmith just nodded, kept hammering, and occasionally offered a grunt that could be interpreted as wisdom. But even with all that interaction, there was always a quiet distance between the blacksmith and the rest of the town. Maybe it was the firelight flickering against his soot-covered face, or the faint metallic smell that clung to his skin. People respected him, but they didn't exactly invite him to dinner. His world was different, hot, smoky, and loud, and that made him a little mysterious. Still, every town needed him. And that meant, socially speaking, he sat somewhere in the middle. Not quite a peasant, not quite a noble, a practical necessity with no fancy title. The church needed him for bells and iron fittings. Knights needed him for weapons and armor. Farmers needed him for everything else. In a way, he connected every layer of society through the simple, steady rhythm of his hammer. But the forge wasn't always a friendly place. In smaller villages, blacksmiths often worked alone, which could get lonely. There's something eerie about working through the night with nothing but firelight and metal groans for company. Some medieval stories even suggest that blacksmiths were prone to strange visions or bouts of melancholy, a poetic way of saying they were exhausted, underpaid, and breathing too much smoke. And then there's the superstition. Remember that sorcerer reputation. It wasn't always flattering. If something strange happened in the village, a cow got sick, a storm hit unexpectedly, or someone's bread didn't rise, the blacksmith might get a few suspicious looks. Too close to fire, too much control over iron, maybe too much power in the wrong hands. In some places, blacksmiths were thought to have struck deals with darker forces, which, ironically, just made their services more in demand. Because who better to protect you from bad luck than the guy who might be friends with it? Now, if you were lucky enough to be a city blacksmith, things were a little different. Urban workshops were busier, wealthier, and often specialized. Some made weapons exclusively for the local garrison. Others crafted locks, keys, or ornate gates for churches and cathedrals. And if you really made it big, like royal contract big, you could end up with steady pay and actual prestige. The king's blacksmith wasn't just another craftsman. He was a trusted servant of the crown, surrounded by guards, courtiers, and the occasional noble who thought they knew more about swords than they actually did. But for the rest, life was a rhythm of hammer, fire, sweat, repeat, 6, sometimes 7 days a week. And it wasn't just hard labor. It was dangerous. Hot metal, flying sparks, molten slag. Accidents were common, burns were constant, and hearing loss was practically a job requirement. The smell of iron, ash, and sweat was permanent. Even the cleanest blacksmith looked like he'd just wrestled a chimney. And yet, people admired that. There was something honest and grounded about the trade. In a time when wealth came from birth or blood, blacksmiths earned respect through effort. They didn't inherit power. They forged it, literally. Let's drift a little further now into the work itself, the materials, the tools, and the strange rituals that kept this smoky world turning, one hammer blow at a time. Inside the forge, everything revolved around rhythm. The forge wasn't just a workshop. It was a kind of living creature, breathing heat and smoke, groaning with each gust of bellows. The blacksmith's hammering wasn't random. It had tempo, like the heartbeat of the village itself. You could tell which smith was working just by the rhythm, fast, sharp, deliberate. The best blacksmiths were almost like musicians, except their instruments were chunks of iron and fire instead of strings and wood. The heart of it all was the forge, a squat structure of stone and clay, where charcoal or coal burned hot enough to turn iron red, then yellow, then white. The smith's tools, tongs, hammers, chisels, and files were extensions of his body. Most of them he made himself, which feels poetic in a very medieval way. A man forging the tools that would forge everything else. When iron glowed just right, that was the moment of truth. Too cold, and it cracked. Too hot, and it burned away into useless slag. The blacksmith's eyes were his thermometer. He could read color the way a baker reads dough. That faint orange glow meant soft enough to shape, but not weak enough to ruin. He'd lift the metal with tongs, position it on the anvil, and the hammer would fall again, and again, and again, until the bar became a blade, a horseshoe, a nail, or whatever the village needed that week. There was something hypnotic about it. The hiss of the quench, the ring of steel, the sigh of the bellows. It was work that demanded focus, almost meditation through exhaustion. Every spark that flew off the anvil was a little piece of life burned away in exchange for utility. People talk about the grind today, but in the Middle Ages, the grind was literal. And yet, there was pride in that grind. Medieval society didn't exactly overflow with social mobility, but craftsmanship was one of the few ways to earn respect across class lines. A lord might sneer at a farmer, but he'd think twice before insulting the man who made his sword. A knight's life literally depended on the blacksmith's skill. A poorly tempered blade could mean the difference between glory and being another name forgotten in a muddy battlefield. Still, despite all the importance, blacksmiths rarely got rich. Iron was expensive, fuel was inconsistent, and work came in unpredictable waves. You might go weeks hammering horseshoes and hinges, then suddenly get a commission for 20 spearheads for the local lord's militia, all due in 3 days. Payment wasn't always in coin either. Sometimes it was food, ale, or the promise of favors that never quite materialized. The other unspoken truth was that not all blacksmiths were independent craftsmen. Many were tied to manors or monasteries. A monastery blacksmith worked for the church, making tools, gates, and even delicate fittings for relics or candles. He might get better food and a roof over his head, but his life was ruled by bells and prayers, not profit. Meanwhile, a manorial blacksmith worked for the Lord, meaning he had to forge whatever the estate demanded, from plowshares to prison bars, often for less than his labor was worth. And if he got too old or too injured to work, well, there wasn't exactly a medieval pension plan. The forge didn't forgive weakness. You either trained an apprentice to carry on your work, or the fire simply went out when you did. That's why apprenticeship was so important. It wasn't just teaching a trade, it was passing on survival. Boys as young as 10 were sent to live with a master blacksmith, sleeping near the forge, learning through heat, noise, and repetition. By the time they were grown, they didn't just know the trade, they were the trade. Every blow, every scar, every burn told the story of a life spent shaping metal. And when a blacksmith died, the village felt it, not just because of what he made, but because of what he represented: endurance, patience, and the quiet courage of a man who faced fire every day and didn't flinch. Let's drift a little deeper now into what exactly they were forging: the tools, the weapons, and the strange alchemy that made iron the backbone of the medieval world. Iron was everything in the Middle Ages. It was the quiet backbone of civilization, invisible until you needed it, and indispensable once you did. A farmer's plow, a soldier's sword, a lady's cooking pot, all of it came from fire and iron, and somewhere behind every piece of it was a blacksmith, sweating under the orange glow of his forge, muttering about the price of coal. But iron wasn't easy to come by. It had to be mined, smelted, purified, and transported long before it ever reached the blacksmith's anvil. Most smiths didn't have access to rich veins of ore. They bought raw iron blooms or ingots from traders who brought it in from mining regions. And medieval transport being what it was, slow, muddy, and occasionally robbed by bandits, prices fluctuated constantly. So when a smith ran low on iron, he didn't just panic. He prayed for the next cart to actually make it through the forest in one piece. Once the iron arrived, it came in two forms: wrought iron, or, if you were lucky, steel. Wrought iron was soft and workable, perfect for tools, nails, and decorative work. Steel, on the other hand, was the good stuff: harder, sharper, and much more difficult to make. It was created by infusing iron with just the right amount of carbon, usually through a process so tedious and smoky that even blacksmiths complained about it. You had to heat the iron, expose it to charcoal, then reheat and hammer it repeatedly. Too much carbon, and it became brittle. Too little, and it was just plain iron again. Basically, medieval metallurgy was one long guessing game played with fire. And yet, somehow, they got it right often. The swords, armor, and tools of the era weren't crude or clumsy. They were surprisingly sophisticated. Medieval smiths developed techniques that modern metallurgists still admire. Pattern welding, for example, was a process where layers of iron and steel were folded together, giving blades both flexibility and strength, and those beautiful, wavy patterns you sometimes see on ancient swords. It wasn't just craftsmanship, it was art born out of necessity. Weapons were, of course, the glamorous side of smithing, the kind of work that earned admiration and envy in equal measure. Making a sword wasn't just about sharpness, it was about balance, weight, and soul. Knights often treated their swords as living companions, naming them and sometimes even blessing them. A good blade could outlive its owner by centuries. But before that happened, it had to survive the forging, the tempering, and the quenching, the final heart-stopping moment when glowing metal was plunged into water or oil. The hiss was dramatic, the steam intense, and if the metal cracked, Well, that was hours of work, gone in a puff of vapor. And yet, not every day brought epic commissions. Most blacksmiths spent their time making more ordinary things: horseshoes, hinges, locks, and tools. A blacksmith who could make a reliable nail was worth his weight in bread. A village's economy literally hinged, quite literally, on his ability to produce sturdy, functional metalwork. So, while ballads and stories love to focus on gleaming swords and shining armor, the real story of medieval smithing was one of quiet, repetitive endurance. Then there was armor, perhaps the pinnacle of a blacksmith's craft. A single suit of armor could take weeks or even months to make. Each plate had to be hammered into perfect curvature, shaped to fit a specific body, and hardened without cracking. Wealthy knights might commission armor so precisely fitted it was almost like a second skin, though not one you'd want to nap in. Some pieces were even decorated, etched with patterns or gilded for show, because if you were going to ride into battle, you might as well look expensive while doing it. For all their skill, though, blacksmiths were rarely given much credit. No one sang songs about the man who made the sword, just about the man who swung it. But blacksmiths understood that. They were the unsung hands of history, content to stand behind the curtain, their legacy glowing in the metal they left behind. Now, while blacksmiths were hammering away at the heart of the medieval economy, the world outside their smoky workshops was changing slowly, unevenly, but constantly. Let's ease our way into how society around them evolved, and how blacksmiths fit into that ever-turning wheel of medieval life. By the time the 14th century rolled around, blacksmiths had become woven into the very fabric of medieval society. You couldn't build a castle, farm a field, or defend a kingdom without them. Every nail in a door, every ring in a chainmail, every iron tool that touched the earth, it all came from that rhythmic clanging echoing through the village streets. The blacksmith shop wasn't just a workplace. It was a heartbeat. Picture it, a small timber structure, open to the street, its doorway glowing with orange light even in the dead of night. The smell of hot metal and burning charcoal hung in the air, mingling with the earthy scent of wet mud and hay from the stables nearby. Villagers would stop by, not just to collect tools, but to gossip, barter, or maybe warm their hands near the forge during winter. The blacksmith, with his soot-streaked face and muscled arms, became something of a local landmark, respected, slightly feared, and often relied upon more than the village priest. It wasn't unusual for people to come to the smith with all sorts of problems. Some practical, some not so practical. Need a broken plow fixed? He could handle that. Need a charm against evil spirits? He probably had a story or two about iron's protective power. In medieval Europe, iron was believed to ward off evil fairies. Witches and restless spirits were all supposedly allergic to it, so people hung iron horseshoes above doors, carried small iron nails in pockets, and treated the local smith as someone with one foot in the human world and another in the mystical. And honestly, the image fit. With sparks flying, the roaring furnace, and molten metal glowing white-hot. The blacksmith's workshop looked like something out of another realm. Even the sound, that slow, deliberate hammering, felt hypnotic. Medieval writers often described blacksmiths as both terrifying and magical, capable of bending the will of the earth itself. A man who could turn stone into steel was someone to be respected, and maybe avoided after dark. Still, being respected didn't necessarily mean being rich. Blacksmiths were skilled laborers, but their wealth depended on their customers. In a poor village, most work revolved around repairs, patching old tools, reforging worn blades, or shoeing the same tired horse for the 10th time. Payment didn't always come in coins either. A blacksmith might receive sacks of grain, wool, or even a few chickens as payment for his work. Money was rare, but barter was universal. In larger towns, however, things were different. Cities like London, Paris, or Bruges had thriving trade networks, bustling markets, and endless demand for iron goods. Urban blacksmiths often specialized. One might focus on weapons, another on locks and keys, another on intricate iron railings or decorative work for cathedrals. They formed guilds, powerful associations that protected their trade, set prices, and trained apprentices. Joining a guild wasn't optional, it was survival. Without guild approval, you couldn't sell your work, and if you tried, you'd likely find yourself mysteriously short on customers. Guild life added structure and a fair bit of drama to a blacksmith's career. Apprentices would start as young as 10 or 12, learning to sweep the floors, stoke fires, and eventually hammer soft metal under supervision. After years of training, they'd become journeymen, traveling from town to refine their craft. Only the most skilled and politically savvy could one day call themselves a master smith and open their own forge. It was a system that mixed talent with tradition, and occasionally, a touch of corruption. The guilds also held feasts, processions, and sometimes petty rivalries with other trades. Bakers thought smiths were too loud. Smiths thought bakers were too soft. But everyone knew that without the smiths, the city's entire infrastructure, from locks to hinges to gates, would quite literally fall apart. And while city smiths had more opportunity, they also faced new challenges. Competition was fierce, taxes were high, and the guild's regulations could be suffocating. Innovation was often slow because guilds prized tradition over experimentation. So even though blacksmiths were among the most essential craftsmen of their time, they were also bound by centuries of rules, a bit like their iron, shaped and hardened by fire, but never fully free. As the centuries turned and trade expanded across continents, the blacksmith's world would start to shift again, subtly at first, then completely. But before we glide into that transformation, it's worth pausing to see how their tools, their methods, and their daily grind, quite literally, held up over generations. By now, the world of the medieval blacksmith had settled into a rhythm as steady as the hammer that defined it. Morning began before sunrise, with a faint hum of the village waking up, roosters crowing, carts creaking, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of the church bell. The blacksmith would already be at his forge, coaxing the first flames of the day to life. The bellows groaned, air rushed into the coals, and soon the heart of the workshop glowed like the sun itself, a small, controlled inferno waiting to shape the day's work. The tools of his trade were simple, but they were everything. A solid anvil, worn smooth from years of blows. Hammers of different sizes, one for shaping, one for finishing, one just to make noise when customers got too close. Tongs for gripping red-hot metal, chisels for cutting it, and a bucket of water for quenching it. The most satisfying hiss you could ever hear after hours of labor. The rhythm was constant. Heat, hammer, quench, repeat. It was the medieval version of a workout routine, except instead of building muscle for fun, you did it to survive. And it wasn't just about brute force. Blacksmithing was half strength, half intuition. The best smiths could read the metal by color alone. Dull red meant it was too cool. Bright orange was perfect. White meant you'd pushed your luck and ruined the piece. It was a kind of dance between man and metal, timed to the flicker of the forge and the steady beat of iron meeting iron. There was no room for impatience. Rush a piece and it would crack. Strike too soft and it wouldn't form. Every mistake cost time, material, and reputation, things a medieval craftsman couldn't afford to waste. And reputation mattered. A well-made plow or horseshoe wasn't just a tool. It was a quiet advertisement that lasted for years. People remembered good work. Lords and merchants sought out smiths they trusted, sometimes even offering them contracts to serve on their estates or work in castle forges. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, which, in the unpredictable churn of medieval life, might as well have been a luxury. Still, the physical toll was immense. Years of hammering meant calloused hands, aching shoulders, and backs that protested every morning. The heat from the forge was relentless. Imagine spending all day next to a bonfire, in layers of wool, with sparks flying dangerously close to your face. Burns were common. So were cuts, blisters, and the occasional piece of molten metal finding its way somewhere you really didn't want it to. Blacksmiths developed a kind of stoic endurance. Pain was just part of the process. And yet, despite the hardship, there was pride in it. A blacksmith could walk through his village and point out his own handiwork everywhere: the iron gate at the church, the hinges on the tavern door, the tools that kept the crops alive. In a world where survival depended on craftsmanship, he was both artisan and engineer, creating the very skeleton of daily life. There was also a strange beauty to it all. In the dim light of the workshop, sparks danced like fireflies. The air shimmered with heat. Every clang of the hammer carried its own melody, a slow, steady percussion that marked time in a way no clock could. For those who passed by outside, it was just noise. But for the blacksmith, it was a kind of meditation. Repetition bred mastery, and mastery bred peace, or at least something close to it. And beyond the village walls, blacksmiths were shaping far more than tools. They were literally forging the weapons that built kingdoms and defended them. Every sword, every suit of armor, every arrowhead was born from fire and sweat. Wars were won or lost on the strength of a blacksmith's work, though no chronicler ever bothered to write their names. Kings got the glory, but smiths made the means. Still, for all their importance, they lived ordinary lives, ate bread and stew, laughed at the tavern after a long day, fixed the same tools over and over. Their legacy wasn't written in books, but in the iron that survived long after they were gone. A hinge that still moved centuries later, a gate that still stood. Those were their signatures, etched into the world quietly, permanently. As time went on, though, the world began to change. Trade expanded, cities grew, and new technologies started whispering of a future where muscle and hammer might not be enough anymore. But for now, in the gentle hum of a medieval forge, everything was still held together by the rhythm of fire and iron, one strike at a time. By the late medieval period, the humble blacksmith had become a fixture of every village, town, and castle courtyard, as essential as the baker or the miller. Without him, nothing worked. The blacksmith wasn't just a tradesman, he was the quiet heartbeat of the community. If a cart broke, people went to the smith. If a knight's armor cracked or a plowshare split, it was the smith who fixed it. And when the Lord needed weapons for his soldiers, who else could turn raw iron into instruments of war? It's funny to think about, but for someone who spent his days covered in soot and ash, the blacksmith was a symbol of reliability. People trusted him with everything from their horses to their homes. He was one of the few villagers who dealt with both peasants and nobles. The common folk needed tools, the wealthy needed swords, and both depended on the same pair of hands. In a world built on hierarchy, that gave him a strange kind of respect. Not fame, not riches, but quiet authority. Of course, that didn't mean his life got easier. Blacksmithing remained one of the most grueling jobs around. The forge fire had to stay lit, often from dawn until dusk, and sometimes through the night if a big order was due. The air inside was thick, the kind that made you cough if you lingered too long. The floor was littered with metal scraps and coal dust. The walls were blackened from years of smoke. The forge was both workshop and sauna, with temperatures easily pushing past anything comfortable. And yet, there was an art to it that no one could deny. Each tool, each nail, each horseshoe had to be made by hand. No machines, no shortcuts. The smith's hands had to be steady, his timing exact, his patience unshakable. A single mistake could waste hours of work and precious iron. Apprentices learned this the hard way, usually with a few burns and a stern lecture. The training was long. A young apprentice could spend up to 7 years working under a master before earning the title of journeyman. During that time, he'd learn everything: how to stoke a fire just right, how to shape metal evenly, how to read the faint shimmer that told you the iron was ready to strike. It was a blend of science, instinct, and endurance. And even after mastering the basics, there was always more to learn. New techniques, new alloys, new ways to make the same old tools last a little longer. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about medieval blacksmiths was how deeply their craft was tied to myth and superstition. People saw something almost magical in the way they tamed fire and shaped metal. The forge was mysterious, a place where ordinary matter transformed into something powerful and lasting. Some thought blacksmiths had special protection from evil, as if working with fire gave them a kind of divine immunity. Others believed they could charm weapons or bless tools to bring good luck. In Norse legends, Gods themselves were blacksmiths, like the dwarves who forged Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. Even in Christian Europe, blacksmiths had a touch of sacred respect. Saint Dunstan, the patron saint of blacksmiths, was said to have once grabbed the devil by the nose with his red-hot tongs when the devil tried to tempt him. It's hard not to admire the mental image, the devil, hissing and squirming, while a calm saint just holds on and tells him to get lost. Because really, that's how blacksmiths were seen: calm, grounded, a little intimidating, but ultimately good. They lived with danger every day: fire, smoke, molten metal, and they did it without complaint. You couldn't scare a man who'd spent his life inches from an open flame. By evening, the forge would quiet down. The fires would dim to a dull glow. Tools would be hung carefully on the walls, and the blacksmith would finally wipe the sweat and soot from his face. Outside, the village would settle to the smell of bread from the baker's oven, children laughing somewhere in the distance, and the fading light catching on the iron sign that marked his trade. It was a simple life, but not a meaningless one. Every hinge that opened a door, every nail that held a roof in place, every blade that plowed a field, all of it passed through his hands. The world didn't thank him for it, but it ran because of him. And somewhere, deep in that rhythmic clang of hammer and anvil, you can almost hear the quiet pride that kept him going. As we drift further into the story, the world begins to shift slowly, quietly, but permanently. The medieval age was winding down, and something new was stirring. The blacksmith's forge, once the beating heart of every town, was about to face its greatest rival yet: machines. Not that anyone in the 15th or 16th century would have seen it coming. For them, the idea that a chunk of metal could do their job faster, cheaper, and with less sweat sounded absurd. But history, as always, had plans. Before the Industrial Revolution hit full force, blacksmiths were still indispensable. Armies still needed weapons, farmers still needed plows, and cities still needed nails by the thousands. The difference was scale. Towns were growing, trade was booming, and the demand for iron goods began to outpace what one man with a hammer could produce. This created a strange paradox. The blacksmith was more needed than ever, yet also more at risk of being replaced. In some larger cities, small forges began turning into blacksmiths who once worked alone now had assistants, apprentices, and even early mechanical tools: water-powered hammers, bellows driven by simple machines. These were the first hints of industrialization. The rhythm of the anvil was slowly being replaced by the rhythm of progress. The sound of machinery was different, colder, steadier, and less human. For the old masters, it must have felt unsettling. Imagine spending your life perfecting the swing of a hammer, the exact pressure of a forge, the patience of metalworking, only to have a machine do it without blinking. Of course, not every blacksmith was swept aside. Many adapted, using the new tools to make their work more efficient. They learned to forge with new alloys, to specialize in complex items that machines couldn't handle yet. But still, the old world was fading. And yet, in rural areas, the blacksmith remained a stubborn constant. Villages still needed him. Peasants still brought their plows to be mended. Travelers still stopped by for new horseshoes. He was part craftsman, part mechanic, part community counselor. His forge was still the warm, smoky hub of gossip and news. The medieval version of a coffee shop, just with more iron dust. You can almost picture it. A small forge near the village green, a few chickens wandering too close to the heat, a horse snorting impatiently while the smith fits its shoe. A tired farmer leans on the fence, watching sparks jump from the anvil. The blacksmith barely notices. He's in his rhythm, hammer up, hammer down, a kind of slow, steady music. The villagers trust that sound. It means work is being done, life is carrying on, and someone strong is keeping the old ways alive. But the more cities grew, the more that music faded. Blacksmiths were slowly replaced by specialized trades: farriers for horses, armorers for weapons, toolmakers for farming equipment. Division of labor made things more efficient and less personal. The village smith was once everything. Now, he was just one part of a larger machine. It's a little melancholic, isn't it? The idea that progress doesn't always sound better. It just sounds different. The world moved on, but the blacksmith's song stayed behind, echoing faintly through memory. And even when the great furnaces of the industrial age began to roar, people still missed that human rhythm, that small, steady heartbeat of hammer and anvil. Still, blacksmiths didn't disappear entirely. They evolved. Some became gunsmiths, others worked in shipyards or railways. A few even found new prestige crafting ornamental ironwork gates, balconies, intricate designs for the new age of architecture. The old fire had changed shape, but it hadn't gone out. And maybe that's the point. Every age has its blacksmiths, people who take raw, unyielding material and shape it into something useful. Whether it's iron, steel, or code, the process is the same. Heat, pressure, patience, creation. The forge never truly dies. It just changes form. So as the night settles around our sleepy little history lesson, imagine the world quieting down again. The old forge, long abandoned, sits beneath ivy and dust. The tools are rusted, the walls cracked, but if you listen closely, you might still hear it. That faint echo of iron striking iron, drifting softly through time. A reminder that even the most ordinary lives can leave a sound that never really fades. So here we are, at the quiet end of our long, smoky journey through the life of the medieval blacksmith. The forge has cooled, the anvil stands silent, and history, ever impatient, has moved on. But before we close the lid on this slow-burning chapter, let's sit for a moment longer in the afterglow of the fire and think about what it really meant to live that kind of life. Being a blacksmith in the medieval world wasn't glamorous. There were no songs written about them, no epic poems, no heroic statues in the town square. Yet, in a way, they were the backbone of everything. Every hinge, sword, nail, and horseshoe carried their signature, not a mark of pride, but of survival. They worked behind the scenes, unseen but essential, holding together a world that often took them for granted. You could say their trade was one of quiet endurance. No fame, no fortune, just fire, sweat, and repetition. But maybe that's what makes it oddly peaceful to think about now. There's something deeply human in that rhythm. Wake up, light the forge, shape the metal, cool it, repeat. The days blur together, not because nothing happens, but because everything is routine, steady, predictable. And that's probably why, when people today think about blacksmiths, there's a strange warmth to the image. It's romanticized. Sure, all glowing coals and flying sparks, strong arms and honest work. But underneath the nostalgia, there's a craving for simplicity. A world where work was physical, tangible, and made sense. Where effort equaled outcome. Where the fire you tended was both your burden and your pride. Of course, the real thing wasn't so romantic. Burns, back pain, smoke, endless heat. Not exactly a cozy lifestyle. Yet, when you strip away the discomfort, what remains is dignity. Blacksmiths built things that lasted. Their work didn't vanish into data or dissolve into air. It stayed in the hinges of doors that still open centuries later. In the tools buried in old soil. In the iron rings of ancient wells. There's a quiet poetry in that kind of permanence. While kings and lords fought wars and vanished from memory, the work of the blacksmith endured. Their creations outlived their names. Their sweat turned into structure. They may not have ruled empires, but they built the tools that made those empires possible. If you think about it, every clang of their hammer was a small declaration. I was here. I made this. And isn't that what everyone wants, in one way or another? To leave behind something that matters, something that says you existed, you contributed, you shaped your tiny corner of the world before the fire went out. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, picture that final scene. The last glow of the forge fades into embers. The blacksmith leans back, hands blackened with soot, eyes half closed. The village is quiet, except for a soft wind threading through the trees. Tomorrow, he'll do it all again, because that's what life was. Repetition, purpose, and a kind of humble peace hidden inside the noise. And while the centuries have moved far beyond his workshop, maybe we still carry a bit of that rhythm within us, that need to create, to repair, to shape the raw material of our lives into something solid. The forge cools, the world exhales. The sound of the hammer fades into memory, and somewhere in that quiet, a new day begins. Now close your eyes, let the faint echo of iron and fire drift away, and rest easy knowing that even the smallest sparks of human effort, no matter how ordinary, have always been the light that kept history alive. Good night, traveler. Sleep well, and may your dreams burn softly, like the last embers of an ancient forge.